Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Night Reader. I'm your host, and tonight I've prepared a tale that will take you on a journey through fear and mystery. Before we dive into the dark, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We're all part of this shared experience, drifting into the night together. Now, as the clock ticks on and the world outside grows quiet, I want you to settle in, turn off the lights, make sure you're cozy under your covers, and let the warmth of your room embrace you. But even with the comfort of your safe space, have you ever stopped to wonder what might be lingering just beyond the light? What unseen forces might be waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves? Tonight I bring you a story of strange occurrences, of hidden things that don't belong in the world we know. But this is no ordinary tale, my friend. No. Tonight's journey will take us to different places, and not all the darkness you'll encounter will be the same. Some shadows are long, stretching over years, while others are fleeting, like whispers in the wind. So, relax, listen carefully, and let the unknown take you into its fold. The road stretched ahead, winding through the dense forest like a dark ribbon, its edges veiled in mist. Mark had always found solace in these late-night drives, escaping from the noise of the city, seeking peace in the silence of the woods. The headlights of his car cut through the fog, illuminating the twisted trees that seemed to lean in, as if eager to watch him pass. He'd been driving for hours, the weight of the day hanging over him like a thick cloud. The solitude was both comforting and eerie, but he welcomed it, desperate to escape the chaos of his life. It wasn't just the stress of work that pushed him into the wilderness. There was something deeper, something gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. As he drove, the road grew narrower, and the trees pressed in closer. His tires hummed against the asphalt, the sound rhythmically calming. He turned up the music, hoping to drown out the feeling of being watched. But it did little to ease his nerves. He tried to shake it off. It was probably just his imagination. Then, as he rounded a sharp bend, the car's headlights illuminated something in the distance. An old, dilapidated house. The wooden structure was barely standing, its windows shattered, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had driven this way countless times and had never seen this house before. Curiosity tugged at him, but caution kept him from stopping. The house looked abandoned, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Still, the drive was long, and his need for a break won out. He slowed the car and turned off the engine, the forest around him falling into an unnatural silence. Not even the wind stirred the trees. Mark stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. He approached the house cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air. Something about the place seemed off. There was an energy here that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as if the house itself were waiting for him to approach, like it knew he was coming. He hesitated before reaching for the door, but the handle turned easily in his grasp, as if it had been waiting for him. With a groan, the door swung open, revealing a dark interior. The smell of mildew and decay filled the air, and Mark wrinkled his nose in distaste. But despite the foul odor, there was something else, something more unsettling, that tugged at him. A faint sound, like soft whispers, seemed to emanate from within. He stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden floor creaked under his weight. His footsteps echoed loudly in the empty house, the sound magnified by the stillness. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in sheets, as if the house had been abandoned in a hurry. But there was something strange about the arrangement. The chairs were placed in a circle, the sheets pulled back in a manner that almost suggested they had been recently used. And in the center of the circle, on the floor, was a large, ornate rug. Its fabric was thick, almost velvet-like, but the edges were torn and stained. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. As he moved deeper into the house, The whispering grew louder, though he couldn't make out the words. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around nervously, his every instinct screaming at him to leave, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him closer to the rug. The whispers seemed to reach a crescendo as he knelt beside it, his hands trembling. He reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the rug, and in that moment, the house seemed to exhale, a heavy, shuddering breath that shook the walls and rattled the windows. The air around him grew colder, and the whispers turned into voices, all speaking at once, murmuring incomprehensible words. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. Mark gasped as the rug began to rise, pulling him downward with an unnatural force. He tried to scramble back, but his feet were caught, as if the very floor had come alive and was dragging him deeper into the house. And then, everything went black. But as Mark's body was swallowed by the darkness far away in another part of the world, something equally strange was happening. On the other side of the globe, in the heart of a small, forgotten village, a young woman named Sarah was preparing for her own encounter with the unknown. The night was calm, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting a silvery light over the quiet streets. Sarah had always loved the peace of her village, where time seemed to stand still. But tonight, there was something different about the air. It felt heavier, charged with an energy that Sarah couldn't explain. As she made her way through the narrow streets, a strange sensation began to creep over her. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, unsettling shadows that danced on the walls of the old buildings. She pulled her coat tighter around her and quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent night. She had been told to stay away from the woods. No one ever went there after dark. But her curiosity got the better of her, and tonight, she couldn't resist. The forest had always intrigued her, with its dense trees and the eerie quiet that surrounded it. Tonight, however, something felt different, almost as if the forest itself was calling her. As Sarah entered the woods, the silence enveloped her, thick and oppressive. The wind had died down, and there was no sound, no birds, no rustling leaves, only the soft crunch of her boots on the ground. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, though she saw nothing. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, looking for movement. But there was nothing. Her heart began to race, her breath coming in short bursts. Something wasn't right. She turned around to head back, but then she heard it, a rustle from deep within the woods. Her pulse quickened as the noise grew louder, coming closer. Panic surged through her, and she bolted, running blindly through the trees. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to get away. The noise grew louder and louder until it was right behind her, and then, in an instant, everything went dark. The darkness consumed her, and for a moment Sarah thought she might have lost her bearings completely. But the silence that followed the chaos was even more unsettling than the pounding of her heart as she ran. Her breath was ragged, her chest tight, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt truly alone. She stumbled through the woods, her hands reaching out to steady herself against the gnarled trees. But when her fingers brushed against the bark, they felt cold, unnaturally cold, like the trees themselves were ice. A shiver ran through her, and she paused for a moment, her feet sinking into the damp soil beneath her. The cold wasn't just the air. It was something in the very forest itself. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, a primal instinct urging her to flee. But where could she go? The trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, no path visible through the dense undergrowth. The feeling of being watched crept up her spine, and her eyes scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, she heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Low, guttural, and so close that it made her freeze in her tracks. "Sarah!" She gasped, the sound coming from the trees around her. Was someone else out here? Or was the forest itself speaking her name? The voice came again, this time softer. like a whisper carried on the wind. Sarah. She took a step back, her pulse racing, but the ground beneath her feet shifted. A sharp pain shot through her ankle, and she cried out, falling to the forest floor. Her eyes widened as she realized she had stepped into something. A deep, dark hole, the edges of which were concealed by the dense underbrush. She tried to pull herself up, but the hole seemed to grow wider, the earth crumbling beneath her. Panic gripped her, and she scrambled to find solid ground. But the more she tried to pull herself out, the more it seemed like the forest was pulling her in. And then, in a cruel twist, a hand reached up from the hole. A cold, skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted, grasping for her. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand tightened its grip on her wrist. The air around her grew colder, and the ground beneath her seemed to shift again. It was as if the very earth was alive, hungry. With all her strength, Sarah pulled herself free, her heart racing as she scrambled backward, the forest around her seeming to close in. She didn't dare look back at the hand that had nearly pulled her into the hole. But the sensation that something was watching her, something lurking just beyond the darkness, was inescapable. Her breaths were ragged now, each inhale and exhale shaky as she bolted forward, ignoring the thorns that clawed at her skin and the roots that twisted under her feet. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, reaching for her legs, trying to trip her up. She didn't dare stop to look around, not until she broke free from the woods. The air was thick with dread, the path forward shrouded in inky blackness. She had to get out. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way once again, and she found herself tumbling downward, her body slamming into something hard. The world spun in a dizzying whirl of trees and sky before she came to a jarring stop. Her head throbbed, and the taste of dirt filled her mouth. She lay there, disoriented, trying to gather her bearings. But it wasn't the forest that surrounded her now. When Sarah opened her eyes, she found herself not in the woods anymore, but in an entirely different place. The first thing that struck her was the cold, a biting, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The ground beneath her was not dirt or grass, but smooth, cold stone. She tried to stand, but her legs were weak, unsteady. It was as if she had been transported to some other-worldly place. She took in her surroundings, blinking against the dim light that flickered around her. The walls were ancient, covered in carvings and strange symbols she didn't recognize. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of something breathing. It was a low, rhythmic sound, almost like a slow heartbeat, but it came from everywhere, reverberating through the very walls. Sarah's heart raced again as the realization hit her. She wasn't alone. But who or what was with her? And on the other side of the world, far from Sarah's predicament, another story was unfolding. In a city where the sun set quickly, casting long shadows over the streets, Greg had spent most of his life avoiding the old neighborhood where he had grown up. It wasn't just the memories that made him uneasy. It was the feeling that something was still there, lingering, waiting for him to return. Tonight, however, he found himself standing at the entrance to that very neighborhood. His feet felt heavy, like they were dragging him unwillingly back to a place he had long since tried to forget. There was no real reason for him to be there. But sometimes, the past has a way of pulling you back. Greg had heard the rumors. People in the neighborhood said the place was cursed, that strange things had happened there for years. People vanished. Strange noises echoed from the old houses, and lights flickered at night when no one was home. The thought of returning to that neighborhood had always unsettled him. But as he stood there now, looking at the once familiar street, he realized that the dread that had plagued him for so many years had only grown stronger. His hand clenched around the strap of his backpack as he walked forward, determined to face whatever had haunted him all these years. The street was quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people, Nothing. As he reached the old house at the end of the street, the one where he had grown up, the door creaked open on its own. He hesitated, but stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, the sound of it reverberating through the empty house. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for him to return. And in the dark silence that followed, Greg could hear something whispering his name. The whisper was soft at first, barely audible, like a breeze brushing through the cracks in the walls. But as it grew louder, the voice became unmistakable, low, almost mocking. Greg. He froze. His heart hammered in his chest as the whispers filled the room, the sound moving like a current through the air surrounding him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, stretching toward him with each passing second. "Who's there?" Greg called out, his voice trembling. His breath came faster now, his hands slick with sweat. He tried to shake the fear that gripped him, but it was no use. The house felt alive, as if it had been waiting for his return. And then, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating, and Greg could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. His eyes darted around the room, trying to make out shapes in the darkness. He could just make out the faint outline of the staircase leading to the upper floor, the banister worn from years of use. There was something up there, something waiting. His feet moved before his mind had fully decided, taking him to the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, the sound so loud in the silence that it felt like the whole house was listening. He reached the top of the stairs, his pulse thumping in his ears. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and foreboding. At the end, he saw the door to his old room, the door he hadn't entered in years. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it swallowing the light from the hallway. Greg's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to walk forward. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the room just as he remembered it. The worn carpet, the old dresser, and the window that overlooked the yard. But something was different now. The room felt colder, as if the air itself had thickened, as though it had been sealed off from the outside world for far too long. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. And that's when he saw it, on the far wall, where once there had been nothing but peeling wallpaper. There was now a message. It was written in something dark, something that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Greg's breath caught in his throat as he approached it. The words, though faint, were clear. "Get out, Greg. It's already too late." His heart dropped into his stomach and he stumbled backward, his back hitting the door frame with a harsh thud. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't just some prank, some old writing from years ago. No, this felt different. It felt as though it had been written just for him, just now. The letters seemed to pulse, almost alive, and the room seemed to shrink around him. The cold grew more intense, a biting chill that made him shiver uncontrollably. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and writhe like they were trying to escape the walls. And then the air itself shifted, becoming thick and oppressive. Greg turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in front of him with a force that shook the entire house. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The walls creaked, and the house seemed to groan in protest. Then, from the corner of the room, something moved. It wasn't a person, but a shape. A dark, shifting mass that seemed to crawl across the floor, its edges blurring and distorting as it came toward him. The sound of its movement was like the rustling of dead leaves, dry and crackling. Greg's heart raced as he backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the shadows closing in and the presence growing stronger with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come back, Greg," the voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't just in his ears. It was inside his head, inside his very soul. The voice felt familiar, like an echo of something he had heard long ago, something that had always been there, waiting for him. And then, just as the shadow reached for him, the floor beneath him gave way. He screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness as he fell. The air rushed past him, cold and oppressive, and for a moment he thought he might never stop falling. But then, suddenly, the ground was gone. Everything was gone. And on the other side of the world, a new story was unfolding. In a small coastal town, where the sea crashes against the cliffs with a relentless fury, Olivia sat by the window of her bedroom, staring out at the dark waters below. She had never been one to fear the ocean. Growing up near the coast, she had always found comfort in the steady rhythm of the waves, the way they seemed to echo the pulse of her own heart. But tonight, something was different. The wind howled through the trees, bending them in unnatural directions. The sky was heavy with storm clouds, and the ocean seemed to churn with an ominous energy, its waves rising higher than usual, crashing violently against the rocks below. Olivia had lived in the town her entire life, but she had never seen a storm like this. There was a strange stillness to it, a sense of something waiting beneath the surface. As she watched, a flash of lightning lit up the sky, casting eerie shadows across the water. And that's when she saw it, a shape moving beneath the surface of the sea. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a shadow shifting in the waves. But as the storm raged on, the shape grew larger, more distinct, as though it was swimming closer to the shore. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, and she leaned closer to the window, her heart pounding. She couldn't look away, as though the shape in the water was pulling her in, drawing her closer. With every passing second, the shape grew more defined, until it was unmistakable. Something large, something that didn't belong in the depths of the sea. And then, with a violent crash, the shape emerged from the water. It wasn't an animal, not a fish, or any creature Olivia could recognize. It was something otherworldly, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to writhe in the air, and a dark, bulbous body that shimmered in the lightning. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were huge and hollow, black as the depths of the ocean. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of Olivia's neck stand on end. It was coming for her. The creature's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the world outside her window seemed to freeze. The wind howled even louder now, as if the storm itself was alive, caught in a frenzy. The crashing waves grew deafening, their roar filling her ears, while the creature's gaze bore into her soul, its presence suffocating the air. Olivia felt her body go cold, as if the very essence of her being was being drained away, pulled toward that monstrosity in the water. She stumbled backward from the window, her heart pounding in her chest, her feet tangled in the rug, and she fell to the floor with a thud, the pain in her knees barely registering as panic overtook her senses. She scrambled to her feet, but her gaze was still locked on the creature, the storm, the chaos outside. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Had it been there all along? Or had it only just emerged, summoned by the wrath of the storm? The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, pushing against the windows as if trying to break inside. The house felt unstable, groaning under the weight of the storm. Olivia knew she had to get out, had to leave this house, this place, before it was too late. But her feet felt like lead. She couldn't look away from the window, from the creature that now moved with a terrifying grace, climbing toward the shore with unnatural speed. The ocean seemed to ripple with its every movement, the water bending and warping around it. It was as though the sea itself had come alive, obeying its every command. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind, but it was impossible. She was paralyzed by fear, rooted to the spot. She needed to move, to escape, but her body refused to listen. Then, the ground beneath her feet trembled. It wasn't just the storm. No, this was something different, something closer. The vibrations were getting stronger, the walls vibrating in response to some unseen force, as if the house itself was reacting to the creature's presence. She could hear it now, too, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the house from somewhere below. Someone was coming. Number, not someone. Something. The hair on the back of Olivia's neck stood on end as the footsteps grew louder, nearer, until they reached the base of the stairs. She felt a chill run through her veins, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to move, but her legs refused to cooperate. The storm outside intensified, the wind pushing against the windows, making the glass creak under the pressure. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and in the sudden silence, Olivia could hear the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, deep, and labored. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was tall, towering over her, draped in tattered rags that seemed to flutter and twist in the air. Its face was obscured by a hood, its features hidden in darkness. But Olivia could feel its gaze, the weight of it pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her throat was dry, her body frozen in place. "Olivia," the voice was low, gravelly, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was familiar, like a memory she couldn't quite place. The sound of it made her skin crawl. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted, and Olivia could feel her heart race in response, each beat echoing in her ears. "Why did you come back?" it asked, its voice seeping into her mind, twisting her thoughts. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell it to leave, to go away, but all she could do was stare at the figure in front of her. The thing moved closer, its dark, hooded face now only inches from hers. Its breath, rank and cold, washed over her, sending a shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't have come back," it repeated, its voice a whisper now, almost lost in the winds outside. "You're too late." A sharp pain shot through Olivia's chest and she gasped, stumbling backward. Her vision blurred, the room spinning around her as if the world itself was collapsing in on her. She could feel the creature's presence, its coldness wrapping around her like a vice. Her knees buckled and she fell to the floor, gasping for air, her breath ragged. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows like smoke carried away by the wind. Olivia lay there on the floor, trembling, her mind spinning in a haze of confusion. What had just happened? What was that thing? Was it real? Had it been real? The storm outside raged on, but the figure was gone. The air in the room grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as though the very atmosphere had been holding its breath. She tried to get up, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Every part of her screamed to leave, to get out of the house, but the terror that had taken root in her heart kept her grounded. She couldn't bring herself to move. Suddenly the window shattered, the glass exploding into the room, showering Olivia in a cascade of sharp shards. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring wind. And then she saw it. The creature from the sea, its twisted limbs rising from the water, now towering above the cliff, its eyes glowing with a haunting light. It was no longer just a shadow in the waves. It was something real, something tangible, and it was coming for her. But there was no escape. And on the other side of the world, deep in the heart of the city, there was another story unfolding. The air in the city felt suffocating, thick with the pressure of a storm that hadn't yet broken. The clouds hung low, almost touching the tops of the skyscrapers, casting an eerie shadow over the streets below. As the night deepened, the streets grew emptier, the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls of the concrete jungle. Julia stood at the window of her high-rise apartment, staring out into the darkness. She had always been a city girl, accustomed to the noise, the crowds, the chaos. But tonight something felt different. The city had an unnatural stillness, like the calm before a storm. Except this storm wasn't one of weather, but something else. Something far darker. Julia had never believed in the supernatural, not really. Ghosts, demons, and things that went bump in the night were just stories, things to keep children in line. But that was before tonight, before the message. It had come in the dead of night, an anonymous email that she had almost dismissed as a prank. But the contents were unsettling, to say the least. You shouldn't have come back. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Some sort of strange, twisted joke. But then the second message came. We're watching you. Julia had been toying with the idea of reporting it to the police, but she knew better. The city was full of strange people. And what were they going to do? Tell her to lock her doors and sleep with one eye open? She had done that already. But something in her gut told her this was different. The fear gnawing at her insides wasn't like anything she'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the thought of someone watching her. It was the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her every moment, making it impossible to shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. The room around her felt colder now, and the lights seemed to flicker ever so slightly. Julia turned away from the window, her gaze landing on the dark hallway behind her. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic far below. But in the silence, she felt it, the sensation that something was off. It wasn't just the emails anymore. It wasn't just the growing unease in her chest. No, something more was happening. Something was coming. A sound broke the silence. Soft at first, barely audible, like a faint tap on the door. Julia froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen any movement. Her pulse quickened, and she hesitated for a moment, staring at the door. The tap came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 Her breath caught in her throat. There was no reason anyone should be here at this hour, not without warning, not without a phone call or a knock on the intercom. She moved toward the door cautiously, her feet heavy, each step feeling like it took forever. The hallway beyond was dark, the apartment building eerily quiet. No one else seemed to be awake. And yet, another tap echoed through the hallway. Julia's hand reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. Her mind raced. Should she open it? Should she ignore it? But no. Something in her gut told her that ignoring it would only make things worse. Slowly, she twisted the knob and cracked the door open, peering out into the hallway. Empty. But there, just beyond the threshold, a piece of paper was stuck to the doorframe with a single piece of tape. It was folded, crisp, as if it had been placed there recently. Julia felt a chill run down her spine as she reached for it, her hand hesitating just before touching the paper. Her eyes scanned the hallway one more time. No movement, no sign of anyone. The hairs on her neck stood up, but she forced herself to take the note. She unfolded the paper with shaking hands. You shouldn't have ignored us. We know everything. The message was brief, but it sent a shock of terror straight through Julia's heart. Who was this? What did they mean? The words felt like they were carved into her mind as she stared at them, her mind struggling to comprehend the meaning. She didn't know who us referred to, but the implications were far too real. She slammed the door shut and locked it quickly, her breath coming in short gasps as her mind raced. Her eyes darted to the window again, scanning the dark street below. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, Perhaps someone watching her from a far distance, but the street was empty. City lights flickered in the distance, the shadows stretching like fingers over the pavement. The apartment felt colder still, and the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed to be the only sound that could fill the suffocating silence. Julia turned, her back against the door as she stood in the center of the room. She needed to think, to understand what was happening. Her fingers reached for her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when she checked, there was no signal. Her eyes widened in disbelief. No service. A low sound rumbled in the distance, an unnatural noise, as if something heavy was moving through the city's underground tunnels, like the growl of an animal too large to be ignored. Julia's heart raced, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the phone in her hands. Then, as if on cue, the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stood frozen. The only sound now the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, turning it on with shaking hands. The dim beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating only the immediate space around her. But it wasn't enough to calm her. A sudden loud bang echoed from somewhere outside her apartment, followed by a low, guttural sound, something that couldn't possibly be human. She turned her flashlight toward the window. The storm had picked up again, the rain now pelting against the glass with unrelenting force. The wind screamed outside, howling like a chorus of angry voices. But it was the shadow she saw just outside the window that sent her into a blind panic. It was large, tall, and it was moving, slowly, and it was coming closer. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs were frozen in place. There was no escape. She was trapped in this apartment with no way out, and whatever was coming was getting closer. And on the other side of the world, in a small, quiet town, another story was about to unfold. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty streets of the small town, a rhythm that seemed out of place in such a peaceful setting. The rain had finally stopped, leaving only the damp, cool air that lingered over the cobblestone roads. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the events of the evening had pushed it into a slumber, one that it might never wake from. Ethan, a young man in his late 20s, walked alone through the darkened streets, his jacket pulled tightly around him to ward off the chill. He had always liked the quiet of the town, its simple charm and slow pace, the way the streets seemed to tell stories from days gone by. But tonight, that peace had been shattered. The town wasn't the same anymore, and neither was Ethan. He had come back only a few days ago, after years of being away. His return had been triggered by something he couldn't shake, a feeling deep inside that something was wrong. Something was off about this place. Something that had been waiting for him. As he walked, he glanced up at the old clock tower in the distance, its face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. It was nearly midnight, and the clock's hands moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if time itself was dragging its feet. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the strange phone call he had received the day before, a call that had come in the dead of night. The voice on the other end had been distorted, as if coming from a deep well, but the message was clear. "You don't remember, do you?" It had taken him a moment to respond, the strange and chilling nature of the call rendering him speechless. The voice had continued, low and slow, as if savoring each word. "The town remembers. You shouldn't have come back." He had tried to shake it off, blaming the call on a prank or maybe a wrong number. But as the days passed, the sense of dread grew. Things had started to happen. Little things at first. Things that made him question his own sanity. Old faces, familiar faces, glancing at him with suspicion and fear. a feeling of being followed, of being watched, even when he was alone. But it wasn't just the people. The town itself seemed different. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was suffused with an unseen presence. It was as if something ancient was waking, and Ethan was its intended victim. Tonight, after another strange encounter at the local diner, he had decided to take a walk, hoping the cool night air would clear his mind. But the town had a way of pulling you back in, of making you confront things you didn't want to face. Ethan quickened his pace as the streetlights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the pavement. He was nearing the edge of town, where the forest began to creep in from all sides. His instincts told him to turn back, to get out of there before it was too late. But then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, where the shadows seemed to swirl and gather. At first it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the flickering street lamps, but as he drew closer he realized it wasn't. It was a person, or at least it resembled one. The figure was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but Ethan could make out the pale outline of a face that seemed familiar, but wrong, as if it had been distorted in some way. The figure's arms hung limply by its sides, and there was something unsettling about the way it stood, motionless, like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and his mind screamed for him to turn around and run, but his feet refused to obey, frozen to the spot as the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Ethan!" a voice rasped, one that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of familiarity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You remember now, don't you?" His breath caught in his throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice from the phone call, but it wasn't just the voice that haunted him. The words themselves, "You remember now," struck a chord deep within him. His mind began to reel, fragments of memories flashing before his eyes. Faces, places, a girl's laughter, a memory of something terrible, something he had buried, pushed so far into the recesses of his mind that he had forgotten it altogether. The figure moved closer, its face coming into sharper focus. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull Ethan in, pulling at his very soul. There was no warmth in them, no humanity, only an empty, insatiable hunger. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered again, its voice now a breathless rasp. The town never forgets, and neither do we. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs shaking beneath him. He turned and ran, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The sound of footsteps followed him, too close, too fast. He didn't dare look behind him. He could feel the presence, the thing closing in, growing stronger with each passing second. The streets blurred as he ran, his heart racing in his chest. A drumbeat of terror that urged him forward, but the way ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was as though the town itself had changed, the roads twisting and bending in impossible ways. The once familiar streets now seemed foreign, hostile, like a maze designed to trap him. Finally, he reached the edge of the town, the dark forest looming ahead. The figure was still there, just beyond the trees, waiting. Ethan had no choice. The town was closing in on him, and the thing in the shadows would never let him go. And far away in a distant city, another person found themselves drawn into a web of terror that spanned across time and space. The connections were invisible, but they were growing stronger. Unseen forces, ancient and vengeful, were at work, pulling the strings of fate in ways that no one could understand. Until it was too late. The sky above the town had darkened further, a thick layer of clouds casting an oppressive gloom over everything. The streets, now drenched with the evening rain, shimmered under the dim glow of the streetlights. But in the midst of this dismal scenery, a car's headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the town's narrow, winding roads as it approached from the outskirts. Inside the car, a woman named Laura gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale and tense. Her eyes darted nervously from side to side, as if expecting someone, or something, to jump out of the shadows at any moment. The town she had arrived in was small, quieter than the city life she had left behind, but there was an eerie stillness about it, the kind of silence that gnawed at your nerves. She had only been driving for a few hours, heading toward her cousin's house in hopes of escaping the chaos she'd been dealing with back home. She had been told the town was a peaceful one, but the second she crossed into its borders, she felt the weight of something ancient press upon her chest. The air here was thick, like a heavy blanket wrapped around her. Every corner she turned seemed to lead her deeper into a maze, and every unfamiliar face she passed held a look of quiet disdain. Laura had always considered herself a rational person, but tonight, as she drove toward the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The trees lining the road appeared to loom taller and closer than they should, their branches bending in unnatural directions, almost as though they were reaching out to grab her. She glanced at the rearview mirror, her heart skipping a beat as she thought she saw something move behind her. But when she looked back, there was nothing there. Only the empty road stretching behind her, swallowed by the dark. Her cousin's house was at the far end of the town, nestled between two hills. Laura had been told it was a secluded place, perfect for unwinding. But with every passing mile, she couldn't help but feel like she was driving into the heart of something much darker. The road ahead curved sharply to the left, and as she rounded the bend, a chilling sight greeted her eyes. Standing at the foot of the hill just beyond the curve was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a long coat that fluttered in the wind. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Laura could feel his gaze even from this distance. It was as if he had been waiting for her, waiting for this very moment. For a moment she considered stopping, asking if he needed help, but something in her gut told her not to. The man didn't move, not an inch, standing perfectly still as if frozen in place. Laura's breath quickened as she sped up, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator, but the feeling of being pursued lingered. Her heart pounded as she neared the man, the headlights of her car illuminating him for just a split second. That was all it took. In that brief instant, Laura saw something that made her blood run cold. His eyes were empty, hollow, dark. Her vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the man was gone. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she drove past the spot where he had stood, but there was no sign of him, no shadow in the distance, only the dark road ahead. It made no sense. She had seen him. She was sure of it. But where had he gone? Shaking, she pushed the thought aside, focusing on getting to her cousin's house. She didn't know why, but she needed to reach it, as if it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Finally, after what felt like hours, the headlights of her car illuminated a large, dilapidated farmhouse, sitting at the top of a hill. The place was far more isolated than she had imagined, surrounded by dense trees that blocked out the light from the town below. As she pulled into the long driveway, the wheels of her car crunching over gravel, Laura let out a sigh of relief. She was finally here. But the relief didn't last long. As she stepped out of the car, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, caught her attention. She froze. Turning slowly, she saw no one. The house was silent. The wind had died down, leaving nothing but the heavy, oppressive silence that had followed her from the moment she entered the town. But something felt off. Something was different about the house. The air around it felt colder than it should, as if the temperature dropped by several degrees as soon as she stepped onto the property. A flash of movement from the corner of her eye snapped her attention toward the tree line. She saw it again. Another figure, But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward her, its form shifting in and out of the shadows like a mirage. Her heart raced in her chest as she rushed toward the house, the footsteps growing louder behind her, following her every step. The moment she reached the door, she turned the knob, half expecting it to be locked. But to her surprise, it opened easily, the creaking of the hinges echoing in the still night air. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pressed her back against the door, trying to steady her nerves. What had she seen? And why did it feel like something was chasing her? Laura had to calm down. She was tired, and this place was making her paranoid. It was just the isolation, the quiet. She hadn't gotten any sleep during her trip. Her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Something was waiting for her here. And on the other side of the world, in another small town, another person had begun their own journey into a darkness they couldn't yet comprehend. The threads of fate were pulling them together, slowly, inexorably, and neither of them could escape what was coming. The town had not forgotten. The night stretched on as Laura tried to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to her like a second skin. She explored the old farmhouse, trying to distract herself from the unsettling events that had taken place outside. The house was exactly as she had expected, large, creaky, and full of outdated furniture. The walls were adorned with old portraits, their subjects frozen in time, gazing down at her with a look of quiet disapproval. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of aged wood filled her nostrils. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold secrets, as though the house itself was watching her every move. She wandered through the living room, her fingers lightly brushing the surface of a table, coated in a thick layer of dust. She sighed, then moved toward the staircase that led to the upper floor. As she climbed the steps, the wood groaned beneath her weight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was just a little off. The house, despite its grandeur, felt empty, but not in a comforting way, more in a suffocating, haunted manner. Reaching the top of the stairs, she walked down the long hallway. The old wallpaper had peeled away in places, revealing the decaying wood beneath. The air was colder here, and the silence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her. She hesitated in front of a door at the far end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, just enough to make her curious. Without thinking, she pushed the door open. The room inside was dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon filtering through a grimy window. It looked like a bedroom, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. The furniture was old, and the bed was covered in a thick layer of dust. But what made her blood run cold were the walls. The walls were lined with strange symbols, scratched into the wood, as if by someone in a frantic, desperate state. She could make out jagged lines, symbols that seemed to shift when she tried to focus on them. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized that these weren't just random markings. They were deliberate. A sudden sound echoed behind her, a creak from the floorboards in the hallway. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly turned her head, her eyes scanning the dim hallway. But there was no one there. The silence returned, oppressive and thick. For a moment, she wondered if she was just imagining things. But when she turned back to the room, she noticed something else. A small figure, almost childlike, was standing at the foot of the bed, watching her with hollow, lifeless eyes. The figure was blurry at first, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she could see it more clearly. It was a girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with long, unkempt hair that hung in front of her face. She wore a white dress that looked old and tattered, her feet bare, and her skin was unnaturally pale. Laura's pulse quickened, and her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. The little girl didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at Laura with that unnerving, empty gaze. In a swift motion, Laura took a step backward, almost tripping over her own feet as she reached for the door. The girl's eyes never left hers, but she remained silent, unmoving. As Laura turned and fled down the hallway, she could feel the cold breath of something behind her, the sensation of being followed pressing against her back. Her footsteps echoed through the empty house, growing louder and faster, as if someone or something was right on her heels. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't dare look back. The door to the staircase was within reach. She ran for it, her fingers fumbling at the knob before she yanked it open and slammed it shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath ragged, her chest heaving with fear. The house was quiet again, too quiet. Laura didn't want to be here anymore. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt an undeniable pull to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. She needed to find her cousin, but she hadn't seen him yet. The house seemed to have swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. But as she made her way back to the front door, she paused. There, in the living room, she spotted a familiar face. Her cousin's. His expression was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his mouth hung open slightly as though he were in a trance. He was standing in the middle of the room, frozen, staring at nothing in particular. "Jason," Laura called out, her voice shaking. No response. She took a hesitant step forward. "Jason, what's going on? Where are you?" Still, no answer. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. Something was terribly wrong. Laura's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, desperate to call for help. But as she pulled it out of her pocket, she noticed something strange. There was no signal. The screen flickered briefly, and then the phone died completely. Her breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped, and she felt the presence again. The one that had been following her since she arrived. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the town. There was something in the air. Something ancient. Something waiting. And she had walked right into its trap. Jason remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the empty space before him. Laura backed away slowly, not daring to take her eyes off him. And that's when she heard it, the faint sound of whispering. It was soft at first, almost like a murmur, but then it grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an unintelligible chant. Laura felt her mind unraveling as the walls seemed to close in on her. Her eyes darted to the door, but it was no longer an option. Whatever was happening, she had to face it. The floor beneath her creaked, and she turned to see the shadows shift, swirling around Jason's still form, crawling up the walls like ink spilled from a jar. The darkness moved toward her. And on the other side of the world, in a small town tucked away between rolling hills, another soul was about to come face to face with something far worse than they had ever imagined. The night was just beginning. As Laura stood frozen, her breath shallow and her mind racing, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. They moved with a purpose, creeping along the floor like tendrils reaching for her. She took a cautious step back, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Jason, still standing motionless in the center of the room, was no longer just a person. His body seemed almost wrong. The way he stood, stiff and rigid, the unblinking stare in his eyes, it wasn't him anymore. "Jason," she whispered again, but this time her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The shadows around him thickened, swirling faster as they pulled towards the walls. The whispers in the air grew louder, their unintelligible words filling her ears. She couldn't understand them, but she could feel them. Cold, dark, ancient. They were alive, and they were closing in on her. She took another step backward, but the shadows seemed to stretch and follow, reaching out for her. Suddenly, Jason's head jerked to the side with an unnatural crack. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time since she had arrived, he moved. But it wasn't the slow, human movements she expected. No, Jason's movements were jerky, disjointed, like a marionette whose strings were being pulled by some unseen force. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural growl escaped from deep within his throat. "Get out!" Jason's voice rasped. But it wasn't his voice at all. It was cold, hollow, and distant. Nothing like the cousin she had known her entire life. Laura stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run far away from this cursed house, but her legs refused to obey. She was paralyzed by fear, her body unwilling to move as the shadows closed in even more tightly. "Get out!" "Now!" Jason repeated, his voice growing louder, more insistent, but still not his own. The shadows thickened around him, wrapping themselves like chains around his limbs. They were pulling him in, dragging him further into the darkness that was consuming the room. Laura couldn't stand it anymore. Her heart raced as her body finally broke free of its paralysis, and she turned to run. But the door to the hallway, the one she had come through only moments before, was now gone. In its place was a wall of inky blackness, a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Her chest tightened as she backed away, the air thick and suffocating. There was no escape. Her mind raced for a plan, a way out. But it was as if the house itself was shifting, adapting to her every move. She turned again, searching for another exit, another route to freedom. But every door, every window, every possible escape was either sealed or blocked. The room was growing smaller, the walls closing in on her. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, heart in her throat, only to find that Jason was no longer in the center of the room. The shadows had taken him. He was gone, swallowed up by the darkness, leaving behind only the faintest echo of his eerie growl. The air felt heavy, as if it were pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She was no longer alone in this place. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, and she realized with a chill that they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, thousands of voices, each one speaking in a language she didn't recognize. They swirled around her, filling her ears, her mind. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with the rhythm of something alive. Desperation surged through her veins as she ran towards the corner of the room, hoping against hope that there might be some hidden door, some crack in the wall that would lead her to freedom. But it was no use. The room had become a prison, and she was trapped within it. The air grew colder, and she saw her breath puffing out in small clouds before her. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, their shapes becoming more defined, more solid. Something was moving within them, something far worse than she could have ever imagined. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced, forming a figure at the center of the room, a figure that was impossibly tall, its form composed entirely of darkness. The eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly with a sickly yellow light. They bore into Laura with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The figure spoke in a voice that was not just heard, but felt, reverberating through her bones. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal on stone. Laura's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she took an instinctive step back, her mind scrambling for an explanation. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure's smile twisted in a way that wasn't natural. "What do we want? We want what is ours, and you. You are the next offering." Laura's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, unable to take her eyes off the figure as it loomed over her. The air grew even colder, and the whispers swirled around her, louder now, more frantic, until they became a deafening cacophony. Offerings, sacrifices, souls, the figure intoned, its words growing louder, each one more powerful than the last. The darkness enveloped her, and she could feel her body grow heavier, as if the very weight of the shadows was crushing her. She gasped for air, but it was as if the room was suffocating her, the walls pressing in tighter with each passing second. The whispers became a roaring storm in her mind, their words becoming clearer now. You cannot escape. You are ours. And just as the darkness closed in, just as the figure loomed above her, a sharp, piercing scream split through the air. A scream that was not her own, but Jason's. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in the very air around her. The figure paused, its glowing eyes flickering with something like irritation. "Not yet," it growled, and with a flick of its hand, the darkness that had been closing in on her retreated. Laura gasped for breath, her body trembling as the figure slowly withdrew, disappearing into the shadows. The air lightened, but the dread lingered, thick and suffocating. And as Laura scrambled to her feet, she realized with a chilling certainty, this wasn't over. The darkness wasn't done with her yet. And on the other side of the world, in a small, unassuming town, another soul was about to face something far worse than they could ever imagine. The night was far from over. The small town of Hawthorne was nestled deep in the countryside, a place so quiet that most people forgot it existed. The streets were narrow, lined with old houses that seemed to sag under the weight of years. The town was a relic, untouched by the rush of modern life, and this suited most of its residents just fine. But beneath the peaceful surface, something had been stirring for years, something that had been waiting. Kara had only recently moved to Hawthorne, drawn by the cheap rent and the promise of a peaceful life, away from the noise of the city. The house she had rented was small, nothing more than a cozy cottage at the edge of the woods. It was exactly what she needed, a break from the chaos of her previous life, a place to start fresh. She had heard the rumors when she first arrived, whispers about the strange happenings in town, the unexplained disappearances, the odd behaviors of some of the residents. But Kara had dismissed them. Small towns always had their fair share of ghost stories and old wives' tales. It was just part of the charm, right? But on one fateful night, the reality of what was happening in Hawthorne began to sink in. It was late, well after midnight, when Kara was woken by the sound of soft knocking on her front door. At first she thought it was just the wind, or maybe a raccoon getting into her trash. But then the knocking came again, gentle, almost hesitant, but persistent. Kara sat up in bed, heart racing. Who could it be at this hour? She slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept to the window to peer through the blinds. The street was empty, no cars, no lights, just the quiet moonlight filtering through the trees. She felt a chill creep up her spine. Then, the knocking came again, louder this time. Kara's heart pounded in her chest as she moved toward the door. She didn't know why, but something deep inside her told her not to open it. Yet, the curiosity, the desire to know who or what was behind that door, gnawed at her. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling, and pulled it open just a crack. The air outside was colder than it should have been for the time of year, and the porch was bathed in an eerie, unnatural fog that rolled in from the woods. Kara stepped out onto the porch, her breath misting in front of her as she called into the darkness. "Hello?" There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of something she couldn't place. Kara stepped further outside, her feet crunching against the gravel path. She looked around, her eyes scanning the yard, the road, the woods beyond. But there was no sign of anyone. She felt an odd sensation, like she wasn't alone. It was as if something was watching her, waiting. The feeling was so strong, so overwhelming that she couldn't ignore it. She turned slowly, her back now to the door, her eyes wide and searching the darkness. That's when she saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. At first it was nothing more than a shadow, barely visible in the dim light. But as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the shape of a person. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a long coat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his gaze on her, piercing and cold. "Who are you?" Kara called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there watching her. Kara's pulse quickened. Her instincts screamed at her to go back inside, to slam the door shut and lock it, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if she were rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the figure. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on her. She could hear the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees, the creaking of the branches, but it all felt so wrong. There was no sound of wildlife, no crickets, no rustling of small animals, just the stillness. "Please, who are you?" Kara repeated, her voice barely a whisper now. The figure took a slow step forward, his long coat billowing around him as he moved. The fog swirled at his feet, as though it were alive, reacting to his presence. Kara's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away from the man who was now only a few feet away from her. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of rocks scraping together. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill down her spine, and with them came a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if those words held some terrible, ancient truth, something that she wasn't meant to understand. The man took another step closer, his face still hidden in the shadows. But now Kara could feel the weight of his stare. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. "Get inside!" he said, his voice growing louder, more insistent. Kara's body finally responded. She turned and ran back to the door, slamming it shut behind her and bolting the locks with trembling hands. Her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned against the door, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But the knocking began again. This time it was louder, more forceful, as if the man on the other side was trying to break through. The sound reverberated through the house, rattling the windows, shaking the very walls. Kara could hear his voice, distant but clear, calling out to her from the other side of the door. "Open it," he demanded. She pressed her back against the door, her eyes wide with terror as the pressure built, as if something was pushing against the door from the outside. The room seemed to grow darker, colder, as the whispers started. They were soft at first, faint murmurs in the distance. But soon they grew louder, more distinct. Kara could hear words now, words she couldn't understand, words that seemed to crawl into her mind and twist her thoughts. "Open the door," the man repeated, his voice now a hiss. Kara could feel her grip slipping, her sanity fraying at the edges. She didn't know how much longer she could hold out. The whispers were growing louder, the pressure against the door intensifying, and the fear that had taken root in her heart was beginning to consume her. But just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door shook violently, and then silence. The whispers ceased. The knocking stopped. Kara dared to breathe again, her hands still shaking as she slowly, cautiously approached the door. There was nothing on the other side. The yard was empty. The man was gone. But the air was thick with the remnants of his presence, as if he had never truly left. And in the distance, deep within the forest, Kara could have sworn she saw something watching her from the shadows. She didn't know how much longer she could stay in Hawthorne, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was that had been waiting for her, whatever had followed her here, it wasn't done yet. And on the other side of the world, Another soul was beginning to realize that they too were caught in a web of darkness that no one could escape from. The night had only just begun, and the horrors that awaited them were far worse than they could ever imagine. The night stretched on, thick and heavy with the weight of something unseen, something terrible that loomed just beneath the surface of everything. Kara was still in the house, her body tense, her mind unable to quiet the whispers that clung to the edges of her thoughts. She had no idea what had happened, whether the man was real or just a figment of her terror. But one thing was undeniable. Something had been with her. Something had watched her. As she moved back into the darkened room, she noticed the temperature drop even further. She shivered, despite the blanket she had pulled tight around herself. The fear was still there, an ever-present weight. She glanced nervously at the windows, half expecting to see the figure standing in the fog, but there was nothing. The silence seemed unnatural. It was as if the whole town of Hawthorne had fallen asleep. And that was the problem. The town had never felt so vacant. And on the other side of the world, we have Eric, who was no stranger to strange occurrences, but nothing had prepared him for what lay ahead. Eric had always been the kind of person who loved adventure, who sought out the thrill of the unknown. The paranormal was his hobby, and the bizarre was his obsession. He had always been skeptical about ghost stories and hauntings, believing them to be mere figments of overactive imaginations. But after a string of strange occurrences in his own life, he found himself standing in a tiny town called Eldridge, a place he'd never heard of before. Eldridge was the kind of town you could easily miss if you weren't paying attention. Its streets were narrow, its houses small and weathered, and the air had a certain stillness to it, as though the place itself were holding its breath. Eric had come in search of a story, something real, something that would get the attention of his readers. He had heard rumors, you see, whispers of a dark past, of strange disappearances, and of a house on the outskirts of town that no one dared approach after dusk. Of course, Eric had to check it out. It was late when he arrived at the house, a large, decaying mansion standing stark against the dark sky. The windows were shattered, the doors slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for someone. Eric was used to the eerie, but even he felt a shiver run up his spine as he stood before the structure. Still, he was here for the story. The house had been abandoned for decades, its history shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was haunted. Others said that terrible things had happened within its walls. But Eric wasn't one to be deterred by superstitions. He stepped inside, camera in hand, determined to capture whatever might linger in the dark. And as he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change. It grew colder, almost impossibly so, as though the temperature dropped the moment he entered. The floors creaked under his weight. The walls whispered softly. Words he couldn't understand, but that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something was here. Something was waiting. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, as he made his way deeper into the house. Shadows clung to every corner, twisting and contorting as though alive. The faintest hint of movement in the distance caught his eye, and he turned. But there was nothing. He took another step forward, his heartbeat quickening. A chill ran down his spine. Then, just as he was about to turn back, the door behind him slammed shut, sending a reverberating thud through the house. Eric spun around, his breath catching in his throat. He was not alone. And back in Hawthorne, Kara's nightmare was only just beginning. She could feel it now, the oppressive weight of something ancient that lingered in the corners of her mind, waiting. The man in the fog, the one who had stood outside her door, was only a shadow of something far worse, far older. The house around her seemed to groan under the strain of it, as if it too were struggling to contain the forces that had been unleashed. She stumbled toward the kitchen, desperate for some sense of control. The light flickered overhead, and the shadows that danced on the walls began to twist into shapes that were almost too familiar. like things she had seen before, but could never fully remember. A soft whispering grew louder, and Kara froze, her blood turning to ice. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her gut, and saw, standing in the doorway, a figure that had not been there a moment before. Tall, cloaked in darkness, the figure's eyes glowed faintly with a sickly yellow light, just like the man in the fog. It was the same presence. Her mouth went dry as the figure spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a feeling, a cold, suffocating weight that pressed against her chest. "You should have left, Kara," it whispered. "You should have stayed away." Her legs trembled beneath her, and for the briefest moment she considered running, but there was nowhere to go. The town itself felt as though it were closing in on her, the ground beneath her feet trembling with the weight of something far older than anything she could comprehend. And on the other side of the world, in the decaying house in Eldridge, Eric took a hesitant step forward, camera poised, heart racing. The whispers grew louder around him, and he felt the temperature drop even further, until his breath was visible in the air, clouding before him. He wasn't alone in the house. The shadows shifted, coalescing into something far worse than he could have imagined. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and shadowy, its form indistinct, but terrifying. The air hummed with a strange energy, a pulse that seemed to beat in time with his own heart. "Leave," the figure hissed, its voice a distorted growl. "Or stay, and suffer like the rest." Eric stood frozen, staring into the thing's glowing eyes, feeling the weight of an ancient curse pressing down on him, dragging him into the depths of something that should have remained forgotten. But there was no turning back now. The house in Eldridge seemed to groan as the figure moved closer, its presence suffocating, a weight that pressed down on Eric's chest with each passing second. His fingers trembled around the camera, but his feet felt like lead. He couldn't look away. The figure's form shifted, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. "Leave," it repeated, its voice a low, rasping hiss that vibrated through his bones. "Before it is too late." Eric's mind raced. What was this thing? It wasn't human, that much was clear. He had seen his share of oddities, but nothing had ever felt this wrong. He'd been hoping for a good story, but this wasn't just a story. This was something far more dangerous. What are you?" Eric managed to whisper, his throat dry, the words barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as if considering him, as if it knew something he didn't. Then, with a sudden movement, the air around him seemed to freeze and the shadows deepened. "Not all stories are meant to be told," the figure finally said, its voice now a cold, dissonant symphony that sent a shiver down Eric's spine. "You have trespassed where you shouldn't have, and now you will pay the price." Before Eric could react, the air around him thickened, the room darkening in an unnatural way. He heard a faint crackling sound, like electricity sparking in the distance, but there was no lightning outside. His pulse quickened, his body tensing as the shadows began to swirl, closing in on him. In the corner of his eye, he saw movement, more shadows, emerging from the walls, seeping through the floorboards. The house wasn't just alive, it was hungry for him. And on the other side of the world, Kara's nightmare had escalated beyond her worst imaginings. The figure in the doorway loomed over her, its presence suffocating, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees buckle. She was rooted to the spot, unable to move, her breath shallow and ragged. The house around her felt as though it were closing in, the walls contracting like a giant fist, squeezing the air from her lungs. You are not supposed to be here," the figure said again, its voice slithering through the air, twisting around her like an inescapable trap. Kara's heart raced, her mind a jumbled mess of thoughts and fears. What was this? She had heard stories, of course, rumors about towns like this, strange happenings, disappearances, but she never thought she would find herself in the middle of it. She never thought it would find her. As she struggled to force air into her lungs, the figure took a step closer, and the shadows that clung to it seemed to writhe, like they were alive. They stretched toward her, reaching for her, eager, hungry. The coldness in the room was unbearable now, a biting chill that sank into her bones. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why me?" The figure's smile twisted, grotesque and inhuman, and it tilted its head to one side as though amused by her question. "Because you are the next, the offering, the one who walks into the dark without seeing the danger. You were always meant to come here." Kara's eyes darted around the room, her mind desperately searching for a way out. There was no door, no window, just walls of shifting darkness. But as the figure advanced, she caught a glimpse of something at the corner of her vision. Movement. A shadow in the corner of the room. And then, from the blackness, a shape emerged. Another figure. But this one was different. Smaller, more human, yet just as terrifying in its own right. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. "Get away from her," a voice whispered, sharp and cold. It was familiar, but not in a comforting way. Kara's heart skipped a beat as she realized the voice wasn't just speaking to the figure. It was speaking to her. It was as though something else, someone else, had arrived to aid her. Or perhaps to take her place. The first figure hesitated, its eyes flickering between Kara and the new arrival. "Who are you?" the figure growled, its voice like gravel being ground into dust. The smaller figure took a step forward, and the air shifted again, the temperature dropping even further, until Kara could see her own breath fogging in front of her. The shadows shrank back at the presence of the new figure, retreating like smoke, being blown away by a strong wind. "You should have stayed away from this town," the new figure said softly. It was a whisper, but it rang with a power that Kara could feel deep within her chest. The figure's eyes, those faintly glowing eyes, burned with a cold fury, but the first figure didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a terrible, screeching sound like the wail of a tortured animal and lunged forward, its hands outstretched toward the smaller figure. Kara's vision blurred as the two figures collided, a violent explosion of darkness and light, and then, in an instant, everything was still. And on the other side of the world, Eric was still trapped in the decaying house of Eldridge, the shadows now closing in on him completely. He could feel them, hear them whispering, urging him to step deeper into their embrace, to fall into the void that they offered. "Leave," the voice echoed one last time, a hollow command that reverberated in his mind. Eric's legs felt like they might give out from the pressure. He stumbled backward, but the shadows were already there, wrapping around his legs, his arms, pulling him into the blackness. He fought, but it was like trying to fight the ocean. The darkness had already claimed him. With a final, desperate scream, Eric was pulled into the inky abyss, the last thing he saw the cold, glowing eyes of the figure as it watched him disappear. The house in Eldridge was silent once again, but deep within its walls, something stirred, something older than time itself, and the whispers began once more. And so, the night continued, an unbroken cycle of terror that stretched across the world, connecting two souls, one in Hawthorne, one in Eldridge, each caught in a web of darkness they could never escape. The horrors were far from over. The stillness in Eldridge was deafening. The old mansion, once a place of whispers and shadows, now stood eerily quiet. The oppressive darkness seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, as though the very walls were waiting, holding their breath. There was no trace of Eric, no sound to suggest that anything had ever happened here at all. Yet, deep within the house, beneath the layers of dust and decay, the very heart of the place seemed to pulse with an ancient hunger. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, feeding off the fear that lingered like a shadow, waiting for its next victim. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that seemed to suffocate the very essence of time. And on the other side of the world in Hawthorne, Kara wasn't faring much better. The smaller figure had disappeared, leaving the larger shadowy presence hovering in the middle of the room, its yellow eyes still burning through the darkness. Kara stood frozen, her mind scrambling to understand what had just happened. The figure that had been trying to attack her, the one that had promised her an awful fate, had simply vanished. She wasn't sure if it had retreated in fear or if something else had happened. But the emptiness in the room now was just as suffocating as the presence that had filled it only moments before. The air was still cold, and Kara could still feel the weight of the malevolent force pressing down on her, though she didn't understand why the shadows had withdrawn so abruptly. It was as if something, or someone, had intervened. A deep, rattling breath escaped her, though it felt like the air itself was still too thin to breathe properly. Her heart hammered in her chest, but the dread that had held her captive seemed to lift just slightly. She turned to look at the door, the one she had shut so hastily earlier. The walls of the house groaned once more, but it felt as though the house had settled into a strange new silence. For a moment she thought she could escape, could finally leave this haunted town, but the whispers returned. Quiet at first, almost like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. They gathered louder, swirling in her mind until they felt like a deafening roar. "Get out," they hissed, the words not just spoken, but felt, sinking deep into her skin. Kara spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. The shadows had receded, but the feeling of being watched, of something still lingering, wouldn't leave. It never did. She needed to leave. And on the other side of the world, something had shifted in the mansion in Eldridge. Eric's absence had not gone unnoticed. A low hum, barely perceptible at first, began to emanate from the very walls of the house. The once silent darkness seemed to stir with a slow, deliberate motion, as though it were waking. And in that waking, something ancient and malevolent began to take shape once more. The shadows seemed to twist and contort as they gathered in the center of the decaying hallway, forming a silhouette, a figure that was neither human nor anything of this world. Its form rippled like water disturbed by a stone, a shape that stretched impossibly tall, then collapsed into itself. Eyes flickered into existence, their pale light casting eerie glows along the cracked walls. For a moment, the figure was still, observing the empty space as if waiting. Then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural murmur that resonated through the house, through the very ground beneath Eric's feet, though he was no longer there. "You cannot hide from us," it said. "No one can." The air thickened again, and for a brief moment the house seemed to grow even darker, until, in the center of the room, the shape of the figure began to pull itself together with more certainty, its form becoming defined, its presence undeniable. This wasn't over. And in Hawthorne, as Kara crept toward the door, her fingers trembling as she touched the handle, her mind screamed for her to leave. The night was too thick, too heavy with something beyond her understanding. She stepped outside into the foggy air. But the fog wasn't natural. It felt alive, shifting, swirling around her in strange patterns, almost as if it were leading her somewhere. She hesitated, her heart racing with the weight of the unknown. But before she could take another step, a voice echoed from behind her, so soft it almost felt like a thought. "Don't run," it whispered. Kara spun, but again, nothing. Only the swirling fog, the press of the trees around her, the heavy silence. The door behind her slammed shut, cutting off her escape. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was as if the town itself had shifted, had pulled the ground from beneath her feet. Something was moving. Something was watching. Her fingers clenched the door handle as if it were the only thing that could save her. But the ground beneath her feet trembled. The air grew even heavier, suffocating her, pressing in from every side. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were no longer whispers. They were voices, hundreds of them, a cacophony of endless cries that clawed at her mind. "Leave!" they shrieked. "Leave now before it's too late!" Kara's legs buckled as the pressure of the town's malevolent energy threatened to consume her, dragging her down into the very earth itself. Her breath caught in her throat, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was alive, and it was pulling her into its depths. And in Eldridge, far away, the mansion continued to pulse with that strange, dark energy. Eric's scream echoed, lost to the shadows that had claimed him. The figure in the house stood in silence, waiting, its eyes flickering again, with the faintest light as though it were feeding off the fear that surrounded it. The ancient house groaned, and with a violent shudder, the ground beneath Eric's feet began to crack open. The darkness was not finished, and on both sides of the world, Kara and Eric would soon learn one horrifying truth. The darkness had claimed them, and they were never meant to escape. The night stretched on. The horrors that followed them had only just begun. The wind howled through the trees in Hawthorne, the fog swirling with an eerie, unnatural motion as Kara's legs finally gave way beneath her. She collapsed onto the cold, wet earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wild with panic. The whispers continued their assault, growing louder, more insistent, until they seemed to fill the very air, suffocating her thoughts, drowning out everything else. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing against her throat, silencing her. The pressure in her chest intensified, and she felt the very ground beneath her quiver, as though the earth itself was alive, shifting in response to the darkness that loomed over her. And then, through the fog, she saw something moving, a figure, tall and thin, emerging from the depths of the mist, its presence unmistakable, malevolent. The figure wore the same long coat she had seen before, the one from the night she had first encountered the shadowy figure on her porch. This time, however, it wasn't just standing there. The man was walking toward her, his long strides unnaturally quick, his face hidden beneath the shadows of his hood. Kara's heart raced, her vision narrowing as she tried to scramble to her feet, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt like the very earth had a hold on her, dragging her down into its depths. "Please, please," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips, desperation creeping into her voice. She tried to claw her way up, but the fog had thickened and the shadows wrapped around her. A tight, suffocating embrace. The figure stopped just in front of her, its face still hidden in darkness. Kara could feel the weight of its gaze on her, an overwhelming pressure that sent a shiver up her spine. "Don't you understand?" The voice came from the shadows, low and gravelly, filled with malice. "You were never meant to leave." The air grew colder, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. Kara's pulse thudded painfully in her chest as the figure slowly raised its hand, its fingers elongated, dark as midnight. The fog seemed to shift in response, forming shapes that danced just out of the corner of her eye, beckoning her to follow. But Kara was done. She could feel the chill creeping deeper into her bones, the darkness pressing in, suffocating her with its weight. Her body trembled as she fought to push herself up, to escape. But there was no escape. With a cry of defiance, she reached for the only weapon she had left, her fear. And just as she was about to succumb, to be swallowed by the shadows, something shifted within her. A surge of defiance, of strength, of something else. It started small, like a flicker in the dark. but it grew. She felt the energy around her twist, fighting against the grip of the fog, pushing back against the darkness that sought to swallow her whole. "You can't have me," Kara whispered, her voice shaky but growing stronger. "I won't be your sacrifice." The figure recoiled, its hand lowering slightly, the coldness of its presence faltering for just a moment. But that moment was enough. With all the strength she could muster, Kara pushed herself to her feet, refusing to let the darkness claim her. In that moment, the fog seemed to pull back, receding just enough to allow her a breath. The figure watched her, its glowing eyes narrowing as if calculating the new turn of events. And then, from the deep, hollowed walls of the house she had just left, she heard a scream. Eric's mind was a blur as he fell through the darkness. There was no ground beneath him, no sense of time or space. It was as if he had been cast into some kind of void where the rules of the world no longer applied. He could feel the pressure of something closing in, the heavy weight of unseen eyes watching him. The shadows had already consumed him, but it felt like he was still being hunted, still being dragged deeper into the abyss. His thoughts raced, but there was no way to escape. There was no light, no direction, no hope, just darkness and the whispering voices. "Eric," one of them hissed, its voice familiar but unrecognizable, like a whisper through a fog. You should have stayed away." He tried to scream, to call out, but no sound came. His throat was dry, the air thick with a suffocating weight. He could feel himself being pulled, not by his own will, but by something far stronger, something ancient and predatory. And then, there it was again, the presence. He felt it, just beyond his reach, something moving in the dark, something watching him. He could see nothing, but he could feel its gaze, its hunger. The shadows curled around him, tendrils of darkness that reached out, wrapping around his body, tightening their grip with every passing second. The cold seeped deeper into his skin, into his very bones, as if the darkness was leaching away his warmth, his life. "Eric," the voice whispered again, closer this time. "You are ours." Suddenly there was a sharp pain, something cold and sharp digging into his chest, pulling at his very soul. The shadows, the darkness, the voices, it was all becoming too much. He couldn't breathe. His chest constricted with an agonizing pressure. His body felt like it was being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The pain, the darkness, the whispers, they were all gone. The weight that had pressed on him, threatening to crush him, had vanished. Eric opened his eyes, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He wasn't in the void anymore. He was in a room, a cold, unfamiliar room. His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faintest glow of a candle in the corner. The walls were cracked, the floor uneven. But there was something wrong about it. There were no windows, no doors. And then, in the corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows, just as tall, just as haunting as before. "You thought you escaped," it whispered, its voice low and mocking. "But there is no escape, Eric. There never was." And on the other side of the world, Kara stood frozen in the fog, her breath shallow as the figure continued to watch her from the distance. The shadows had begun to close in once again, but this time, something was different. She could feel it. The air was alive with the crackling energy of ancient forces, forces beyond her comprehension. The darkness wasn't finished with either of them. Not yet. And the night was far from over. The wind howled again, whipping through the trees like a living thing, as Kara stood in the middle of the fog-blanketed yard, her heart racing. The figure still loomed in the distance, though its form seemed to flicker and shift like a mirage in the moonlight. It was there, and then it wasn't. its presence lingering like a shadow on the edge of her vision, always just out of reach. Kara could feel the energy around her, thick and oppressive, pressing against her chest as if the very atmosphere was alive. She turned in a frantic circle, trying to find an escape, but the fog seemed to close in tighter with every breath she took. She could hear it now, the whispers again, low and guttural, weaving through the air, crawling under her skin. "You can't run forever," the voice murmured, its tone deep and dripping with malice. "You've already crossed the line." Her mind raced, trying to grasp onto something, anything, that could explain what was happening. What had she stumbled into? What had she awakened in this cursed little town? She thought back to the rumors she had heard when she first arrived, about the disappearances, the strange happenings, the whispers in the dark. Was it all true? A cold hand of realization gripped her heart. There was no going back now. She had to move. But where? With her pulse hammering in her ears, Kara took a tentative step forward. The fog swirled around her, seeming to part and then close again, as though it had a mind of its own. She turned back toward the house, but the sight of the darkened windows, the silhouettes inside, made her hesitate. It was no longer a sanctuary. The place where she had once felt safe now seemed like a trap, an extension of the darkness that had already begun to take root in this town. The ground beneath her feet shifted suddenly, as though the very earth was opening up. Kara staggered, trying to steady herself, but the air had thickened. She could feel her legs growing heavy, as if the weight of the fog itself was pulling her down into the dirt. "No," she whispered fiercely, shaking her head. "Not again. I won't be another offering." And then the figure was there, standing directly in front of her, blocking her path with its towering presence. It had materialized from the darkness, moving in an unnatural, jerking way, like it was still learning how to exist in the physical world. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a void, an endless blackness that swallowed the light. The faint, sickly yellow glow of its eyes were the only hint that something was there at all. "You don't get to choose," the figure said, its voice coming from everywhere at once, echoing inside her mind. "You've already chosen." Kara's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back. The figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting, watching her with patient, unblinking eyes. It was getting closer, the distance between them shrinking, though Kara could no longer summon the strength to run. "You were meant to come here," it hissed, each word dripping with something ancient and twisted. "This town, this place, it needs you." Kara couldn't think. The words tangled in her mind, dizzying her as the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into their grip. Every inch of her body screamed to flee, to escape. But the more she tried to move, the heavier the air became. And then she saw it. A flash of movement from the corner of her eye. At first she thought it was just another trick of the fog, but there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a person, a woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollowed eyes that glowed faintly with that same sickly yellow light. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound emerged. The woman's hands were outstretched, reaching toward Kara, as if begging for help, or perhaps warning her. But before Kara could move, the figure in front of her spoke again, its voice low and dangerous. She tried to escape too. She failed. "You will fail as well." Kara's chest tightened. The woman at the edge of the woods, it was her, the one who had disappeared, the one who had been taken. Kara was next, the next sacrifice in this cursed town. There was no escaping it, no hope. But something inside her refused to give up. She couldn't let this be her end. With trembling hands, she reached for the ground, feeling for something, anything she could use. Her fingers brushed against something cold, rough. She gripped it tightly, her nails digging into the object. It was a rock. She didn't know why, but she hurled it toward the figure. For a moment, the world held its breath. The rock struck the figure's form, and for a fraction of a second, its darkness flickered. The ground beneath Kara's feet rumbled, and the whispers fell silent. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone. The fog, too, seemed to recede, like a wave pulling back from the shore. The woman in the distance vanished, her form dissolving into the shadows, leaving only the empty, cold woods behind. Kara stood there, panting, her mind racing, her heart still pounding in her chest. The air seemed to lighten, though the feeling of dread still clung to her like a second skin. But it was over, right? The town couldn't hold her anymore. The darkness had receded. And yet, the faint whisper in the back of her mind, the sensation of being watched, told her that the night was far from over. There was something else out there, something more waiting, lurking in the dark corners of the world. Across the ocean, Eric's body trembled as he stood in the pitch-black room, his eyes fixated on the figure in front of him. It was taller now, its shape more solid, its form no longer a shifting shadow. The man's face was still obscured, but the air in the room had thickened, growing colder with every passing second. "You thought you had escaped," the figure said, its voice low and mocking. "But there's no escape from us." Eric's throat was dry, and his body was frozen in place. He wanted to speak, to ask what this thing was, what it wanted, but the words wouldn't come. His chest was tight, and his limbs felt like they were made of stone. The figure moved toward him, its presence overwhelming, suffocating, and as it came closer, the room seemed to warp, its walls closing in, the space shrinking. "You're not the first to come here, Eric," the figure whispered, its voice low and filled with ancient power. "And you won't be the last." The ground beneath Eric's feet began to tremble, and the shadows around him seemed to writhe, coming alive, wrapping themselves around his legs, pulling him deeper into the darkness. And then the figure's voice echoed again, louder this time, as the air seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "You belong to us now." The walls cracked open, and the darkness consumed him whole. And on the other side of the world, in the heart of the forest, Kara stood still, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The night was far from over. The forest around Kara felt alive, its silence pressing in on her, suffocating and relentless. The fog had receded, but the shadows clung to the trees like an old, familiar nightmare. She could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves, yet the stillness was the most deafening sound of all. Kara tried to steady her breathing, but each exhale felt like a battle. Every step she took felt weighted, like the forest itself was pushing back, resisting her escape. Her mind raced. Where could she go? She couldn't go back to the house. It was no longer safe. The figure, the man who had spoken in that low, gravelly voice, had left something behind, a feeling of gnawing dread that refused to let go. She turned, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the figure to emerge from the trees again. But there was nothing. The darkness remained, quiet and oppressive. She shook her head, trying to push the fear down. She had to keep moving. Kara's footsteps were careful, almost hesitant, as she walked deeper into the forest. The trees loomed above her, like silent sentinels, their branches stretching out like fingers, as if they were reaching for her, waiting for her to come closer. Her eyes darted from side to side. But every time she thought, she saw something in the shadows. It was gone before she could focus. And then, just as the tension in her chest began to crack, she heard it. A faint sound, like the snap of a twig beneath someone's foot. Kara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was too deliberate, too close. She turned slowly, scanning the forest around her. The trees seemed to close in, the path narrowing with every breath she took. The fog wasn't completely gone. It was lingering, just out of sight, coiling in the corners of her vision, always there, but not visible enough to hold any form. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would somehow draw more attention to her presence. "Is someone there?" For a moment there was nothing. Silence, thick and heavy. Then came the whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but it made her skin crawl. She turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. "You're not alone." The voice was familiar but distorted, like it was echoing from the walls of her mind. Her stomach churned, and her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Not yet. From the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged. It was hunched, its form too thin, its limbs too long, its head lolled to one side, its eyes wide and unblinking. A woman. No, not a woman. Something else entirely. Her mouth was open in a scream, but no sound came out. The woman's face was pale, sickly, with the skin stretched taut over her bones. Her hair hung in long, tangled strands that seemed to float in the air, moving with a mind of their own. "You shouldn't have come," the woman rasped, her voice a broken, hollow whisper. "None of you should have come." Kara's blood ran cold. She could barely breathe as the figure took a step forward, its eyes locked on her. The woman's form flickered, like she was fading in and out of existence, the darkness of the forest swallowing her whole. "What do you want?" Kara whispered, her voice shaking, but the words felt foreign, disconnected from her fear. "Who are you?" The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, a smile that didn't belong on a human face. "What I want," she hissed, "is what you've already given." Kara's legs threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to stay upright. She had to get away, she had to. But the woman lunged at her faster than Kara could react. The darkness swallowed her whole, and everything went black. And on the other side of the world, in a small, quiet town nestled among the rolling hills, Jason stood at the window of his home, staring into the night. The moonlight filtered through the clouds, casting long, eerie shadows across the street. The town of Wraithville had always felt a little off, its quiet charm tinged with a kind of unease that Jason had never been able to shake. The whispers had started again. At first they were faint, like the wind through the trees, but now they were growing louder, pressing in on him. They came in the dead of night, creeping into his thoughts, curling around his mind until he couldn't tell where his own thoughts ended and the whispers began. He had tried to ignore them, dismiss them as stress or fatigue, but deep down he knew something was wrong. Something was wrong with this town. He had heard the stories, the disappearances, the strange occurrences that no one ever talked about openly. But he had never believed them, not until now. Jason's hands clenched into fists as the whispers grew more distinct. He could almost hear words now, though they were indistinguishable, like a language he wasn't meant to understand. He took a step back from the window, his heart racing, but then something caught his eye. In the distance, just past the edge of the woods, he saw a figure standing in the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as Jason squinted, he could make out the shape of a man. Tall, thin, his face hidden in the darkness. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move. "Who's there?" Jason called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound confident. No answer. Jason took a step forward, instinct pulling him toward the door. He didn't know why, but something about the figure felt wrong, like it was calling to him. The door creaked as he opened it, the cool night air rushing in, filling his lungs with a strange, metallic scent. He stepped outside, squinting into the darkness, trying to find the figure again, but it was gone. His pulse raced, and his feet froze in place. Had he imagined it? Was it just the shadows playing tricks on him? Jason took another step, then another, his eyes scanning the yard. There was no sign of anyone, but the whispers were back, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. "You can't escape," the voice said, cold and malevolent. "You've been chosen." Jason's blood ran cold as the darkness around him seemed to shift. The shadows stretched, bending and warping until they formed a figure, a tall, thin figure, just like the one he had seen. The figure moved toward him, its face still obscured by the darkness. "Who are you?" Jason demanded, his voice cracking. The figure stopped just a few feet away from him. It was close enough that Jason could feel the chill of its presence, a bone-deep cold that made him shiver. The figure tilted its head, then spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper. "I am what you cannot escape." Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against his arm. And in that moment, Jason realized with a sickening certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. The whispers, the shadows, the figure, it was all connected. And now, there was no turning back. The darkness had been waiting for them. It had followed them across time, across distance. It knew no boundaries, no mercy, no escape. And as the last breath left Jason's lungs, the whispers grew louder, their voices now one, united in their eternal hunger for souls. The night was over, the end had come, and they were never truly alone. Thank you for spending this time with me here on The Night Reader. I hope these stories helped you relax, unwind, or maybe even drift off to sleep. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the mysterious and unknown, please leave a like and consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel and allows me to bring you even more immersive, long-form storytelling. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and which story was your favorite. Good night, rest well, and I'll be here waiting for you with more chilling tales next time, right here on The Night Reader.